Jace Callan had been expecting a quiet birthday. Nothing crazy, just some drinks, maybe a new ship upgrade if his friends had pooled their credits together. He had not, in any version of reality, expected to be standing in his garage with a terrified alien girl clinging to his arm like he was the only thing keeping her alive. And yet, here he was. His three best friends, Carter, Miguel, and Lena, stood in a semicircle around him, looking way too pleased with themselves, which was concerning given the circumstances. Jace's brain stalled. He pointed at the trembling girl. "The hell is this?" Carter grinned. "Your birthday present." Jace's eye twitched. "Try again." Miguel held up his hands. "Okay, so funny story." Jace cut him off with a glare. "No version of this is funny." Lena sighed. "Look, we may have made a mistake." The girl still hadn't let go of him. Her fingers clutched his sleeve in a death grip, her entire body pressed against his side. She was small, at least compared to him, but she wasn't some fragile thing. Even through her obvious fear, there was a quiet strength in the way she moved, in the way her silver-white hair fell over her shoulders as she glanced around the room like a cornered animal. And then there were her eyes, luminous blue, glowing faintly in the dim light. Right now they were filled with panic. Jace clenched his jaw. "Explain, now." Miguel rubbed the back of his neck. "So, we were on that deep web auction site, you know, the weird one with all the black market tech." Jace narrowed his eyes. "And we found a listing for an AI companion." Carter grinned like this was somehow an exciting detail. "We thought it'd be hilarious to get you one." Jace stared. "You bought me a robot girlfriend." Miguel coughed. "More like one her. It was a bidding thing." Lena sighed. "And she's not a robot." Jace turned back to the girl. She still hadn't moved, still hadn't let go. His stomach twisted. "You bought a person." Miguel winced. "Not on purpose." Lena nodded. "We thought it was a virtual assistant or maybe some weird hologram thing. We figured out real quick that wasn't the case when she got delivered in a containment pod." Jace ran a hand down his face. "And your solution was to dump her on me." "She already latched onto you, man," Carter said with a helpless shrug. "The second she saw you, she grabbed your arm." "We didn't know what to do." Jace looked down. The girl Veyna, according to the ID chip Lena had scanned, was shaking. He exhaled and lowered his voice. "Hey." Her eyes darted up to his face. "You understand me?" Veyna hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Some." Her voice was soft, unsteady. "All right." Jace tried to move his arm. She didn't let go. "Look, you don't have to." The second he pulled away, her breathing turned sharp and ragged. Her grip tightened, her entire body trembling. Jace swore under his breath. Okay, not pulling away." He shot his friends a glare. "You guys screwed up bad." Miguel sighed. "We know. We need to figure out where she came from," Lena added. "Find out who she belongs to." Jace felt Veyna flinch against him. She spoke again, voice shaking. "No, belong." Jace's stomach twisted. Miguel frowned. "Wait, does she mean?" The moment was cut off by a sharp beeping sound. Veyna went stiff. Jace looked down. A thin, metallic band was wrapped around her ankle, previously unnoticed under the emergency blanket draped over her shoulders. The small light on the side had been a steady green. Now it was blinking red. "What is that?" Carter asked. "Bad," Veyna whispered. Jace's instincts kicked in just as the garage door exploded inward. The shockwave threw them all backward, sparks flying as debris rained down. Jace hit the ground hard, rolling onto his side as his ears rang. His vision blurred, but he could make out dark figures storming inside, weapons raised, mercs, armed to the teeth. Through the chaos, Veyna scrambled toward him, her fingers grasping for his jacket. Pure panic filled her glowing blue eyes. A rough voice cut through the ringing. "Target acquired." Jace barely had time to process that before someone fired a stun round straight at Veyna's chest. Jace didn't think. He moved. The stun round was fast, a glowing pulse of blue light streaking toward Veyna's chest. But Jace had spent most of his life in back alley brawls and under-the-table skirmishes, and his reflexes kicked in before his brain even caught up. He grabbed her and twisted, shielding her with his own body. The stun round hit him square in the shoulder. Electricity ripped through him like fire in his veins. His muscles locked, his vision blurred, and he hit the ground hard. Somewhere in the chaos he heard Veyna scream. His body refused to move. He felt hands gripping him, Veyna pulling at him desperately, but his limbs were dead weight. Shit. Boots stomped across the debris-covered floor. The mercs spread out, their dark armor gleaming under the flickering garage lights. One of them, taller than the rest, took a step forward, scanning the room with a cold efficiency. "Stand down," he barked. Jace gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. Miguel and Carter had ducked behind Jace's speeder, weapons half drawn but frozen. Lena, ever the strategist, was already moving toward the side door, probably looking for a way out. But Jace wasn't the one they were after. The merc leader's visor locked onto Veyna. "Target identified," he said, lifting a heavy-duty restraint device. "Surrender quietly and no one else gets hurt." Veyna was shaking violently. Jace's mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his muscles were still sluggish from the stun shot. Then Veyna did something unexpected. She snarled. It wasn't a sound Jace had ever heard from something so small, so delicate. It was deep, guttural, an animalistic warning. Her glowing blue eyes burned, and for the first time since she'd appeared, she didn't look fragile. She looked dangerous. The lead merc sighed. "Figures." He raised his weapon. Jace finally got his limbs working. His fingers brushed his holster. His blaster was still there. With a burst of effort, he yanked it free and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough. The merc leader dodged, the stun round grazing his armor. Chaos erupted. Miguel and Carter sprang into action, guns blazing. Lena dove for cover, returning fire from behind a storage crate. The mercs reacted instantly, sending a hail of plasma bolts across the garage. Sparks flew as Jace's equipment exploded under the assault. Jace forced himself up, grabbing Veyna's wrist. "Move!" She didn't hesitate. They ran. Jace's garage had two exits, the main bay doors now a smoking wreck, and the side maintenance hatch leading to the alley. He pulled Veyna toward the hatch, dodging stray blasts as they went. Behind them, Miguel let out a victorious shout. "Hell yeah, eat plasma, you bastards!" Jace didn't have time to check if they were winning. He slammed his fist against the hatch panel, praying it wasn't locked down. The door hissed open. Fresh night air flooded in. Veyna practically dragged him through, her grip tight around his hand. Jace turned back. "Lena," she heard him. From her cover she gestured wildly. "Get her out of here, we'll handle these guys." Jace didn't want to leave them, but he knew they could handle themselves. The best thing he could do was get Veyna as far away as possible. He sprinted into the alley, dragging her with him. The city stretched out before them, a maze of neon lights, towering spires, and winding streets. Smoke from the explosion curled into the air, alarms blaring in the distance. Jace glanced over his shoulder. The mercs were right behind them. Jace pulled Veyna through the alley, his heart pounding in sync with the heavy footfalls behind them. The mercs were fast, faster than they should have been in that armor. But Jace had spent his whole life running from trouble, and he knew these streets better than they did. "This way." He yanked her down a side path, barely squeezing between a rusted storage unit and a crumbling old water purifier. Veyna gasped but followed without hesitation. A plasma bolt scorched the wall beside them, sending sparks into the air. They weren't going to outrun them, not like this. Jace's mind worked frantically. The mercs were too well equipped to be local bounty hunters. These guys were professionals. That meant they had resources, comms, a likely rendezvous point where reinforcements could cut them off. If they didn't shake them now, they were screwed. Up ahead, the alley split in two. Jace made a split-second decision. He shoved Veyna toward the left path. "Keep running." Her eyes widened in panic. What? Trust me. He didn't give her a chance to argue. He bolted right. The second he did, 3 of the mercs turned and followed him. Good. Jace pushed himself harder, zigzagging between dumpsters and stacks of old scrap metal. He needed to buy her time. The mercs weren't here for him. He was just an obstacle. If they lost sight of Veyna, they'd regroup, reassess, and he could loop back. Another plasma round whizzed past his ear. Shit. He vaulted over a low wall, landing in a heap of discarded engine parts. He barely had time to roll before a merc rounded the corner, weapon raised. Jace grabbed the nearest thing, a broken fuel rod, and hurled it. The rod slammed into the merc's helmet with a metallic clang, staggering him long enough for Jace to duck into a narrow passageway. The other 2 mercs weren't far behind. Jace spotted a loose drain pipe overhead and leapt, grabbing it with both hands. With a grunt, he hauled himself up, swinging his legs over onto the fire escape above. Below, the merc skidded to a stop, scanning the area. Where'd he go? One of them barked. Jace pressed himself flat against the rusted metal. The leader swore, "Forget him, we still have the tracker on the girl." Jace's blood ran cold. Veyna, the ankle band. Without another word, the mercs turned and sprinted back toward the main alley. Jace didn't waste time. He climbed onto the nearest rooftop and ran. Veyna hadn't gotten far, not on her own. He scanned the streets below, heart hammering. Then finally there. She was curled in a shadowed alcove beneath a neon sign, chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. Her hands were clutched around her ankle, fingers desperately trying to pry off the blinking metal band. Jace jumped down, landing hard enough to make her flinch. She looked up, and relief flooded her glowing blue eyes. "Jace," he dropped to his knees beside her. "They're tracking you through this thing." He grabbed her ankle, fingers searching for a latch. "Does it come off?" Veyna shook her head, panicked. "Not no key, it's," she struggled for the right words. "Locked by signal," Jace swore under his breath. That meant it wasn't just a restraint, it was a beacon, a live beacon, and it was flashing red. They had seconds. Jace pulled his blaster and aimed. Veyna gasped. "Wait," he fired. The plasma shot hit the restraint dead center, melting the mechanism in an instant. The band hissed and sparked before snapping apart, falling away in 2 smoking pieces. Veyna let out a shaky breath. Jace grabbed her hand. "Run." No hesitation this time. They took off just as the mercs rounded the corner, but without the tracker, the game had changed. Jace wasn't running blind anymore. He had a plan. Jace led Veyna through the winding back streets, cutting through hidden paths only someone who had lived here long enough would know. Without the tracker, the mercs had lost their biggest advantage, but they weren't giving up. Behind them, the sounds of boots slamming against pavement echoed in the night. The mercs were splitting up, trying to flank them, trying to funnel them into a dead end. Jace wasn't going to let that happen. He yanked Veyna into a narrow alley barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. The walls were grimy, the smell of rust and damp metal thick in the air. He pressed his back to the cold surface, pulling her close to keep them hidden. Veyna's breath was warm against his neck, rapid and unsteady. Her hands clutched his jacket, her body trembling slightly. Footsteps approached. Jace held his breath. A shadow passed by the alley entrance, hesitated, then moved on. Jace counted to 5 before exhaling. "We need a real exit," Veyna whispered. She was right. Running would only last so long. He needed a way to end this chase, and he had an idea. "Come on." He took her hand and pulled her through the alley, cutting toward an old industrial zone on the outskirts of the district. The area was mostly abandoned. Half-built structures, rusting scaffolding, forgotten machinery. A perfect place to set a trap. Jace led her up a set of rickety stairs into the shell of an unfinished building. The framework was intact, but the walls were skeletal, exposed beams and metal supports stretching into the night sky. "This will work," he muttered. Veyna gave him a skeptical look. "For what?" Jace knelt, rummaging through the debris. His fingers found what he was looking for, a set of old power cells, likely left behind when construction had been abandoned. He grinned. For turning the tables. Veyna's eyes flickered with understanding. You want to? A gunshot cracked through the night. They ducked instinctively. The mercs had found them. Jace moved fast, yanking Veyna behind a stack of metal crates. How good are you at distractions? She blinked. Define good. Jace shoved one of the power cells into her hands. Hold this. He grabbed 2 more for himself and started wiring them together with frayed cables. When I say now, throw it as far as you can. Veyna didn't argue, she just nodded. Footsteps echoed up the stairs. The mercs were coming in, weapons raised. Jace worked faster, twisting wires together. The power cells weren't meant for this, but with enough of a charge, he sparked a connection. A high-pitched whine filled the air. The mercs hesitated. Now, Veyna threw the power cell with surprising force. It clattered across the floor, landing right in the middle of the mercs' formation. Jace activated his. The cell exploded in a burst of blinding blue energy. Not deadly, but bright enough to turn the entire world into a blinding white haze. The mercs shouted in confusion, weapons firing wildly. Jace didn't wait. He grabbed Veyna's hand and ran. They sprinted through the unfinished structure, dodging falling debris as the blast shook the unstable framework. The mercs were still reeling from the flash, giving them just enough time to make it to the other side. Jace spotted a fire escape leading down. This way. They climbed down just as the mercs recovered, their shouts furious. Plasma rounds slammed into the metal railings, sparks flying. Jace leapt the last few feet, landing hard on the cracked pavement below. He turned, catching Veyna as she followed. They hit the ground running. The city stretched before them, but Jace wasn't heading toward safety anymore. He was heading toward answers, and he knew exactly who could give them. Jace knew the perfect place to disappear. The mercs were fast, but they didn't know this city like he did. He pulled Veyna through the maze of side streets, dodging neon-lit storefronts and stumbling past night market stalls. People gave them wary glances but didn't intervene. This part of the city thrived on minding its own business. But Jace wasn't just running anymore. He had a destination. Veyna's grip on his hand was tight, her breathing unsteady. Where are we going? Jace glanced back. She looked exhausted, her violet-tinted skin damp with sweat. He slowed slightly, guiding her into a recessed doorway where the dim lighting gave them some cover. Someone who can help, he said, peeking around the edge of the street. Veyna exhaled sharply. You trust them? Jace hesitated. The real answer, not really, but he didn't have many options. We don't have a choice. He scanned the rooftops. No drones. That was a good sign. The mercs weren't bothering with subtlety. They were hunting with brute force, sweeping the streets in formation. They had minutes at best. Jace grabbed Veyna's wrist and moved again, leading her toward the old industrial district. After several turns, he stopped in front of what looked like a rundown auto shop. The flickering neon sign above the door read Vaughn's Fix IT. Veyna gave him a doubtful look. A mechanic. Jace knocked twice, then once more. A mechanical whir sounded as a scanner activated above the door. After a few tense seconds, the locks disengaged with a heavy clunk and the door cracked open. A burly man with cybernetic arms and a permanent scowl peered out. His eyes locked onto Jace, then flicked to Veyna. You're gonna get me killed, kid. Jace pushed inside. Good to see you too, Vaughn. The shop smelled like burning metal and engine grease. Half-assembled hover bikes and stripped-down machinery littered the floor. The walls were lined with spare parts, some legal, some very much not. Veyna lingered near the doorway, clearly uneasy. Vaughn shut the door, activating several security locks. Why the hell do you have a syndicate-wanted alien trailing after you? Jace crossed his arms. You tell me, who put the contract out? Vaughn exhaled through his nose. He moved to a terminal, pulling up a holo display. With a few keystrokes, streams of bounty data scrolled across the screen. He tapped one. A mugshot of Veyna appeared along with a price tag that made Jace's stomach tighten. 50,000 credits. Jace let out a low whistle. That's a lot. Veyna paled. They really want me back. Vaughn folded his arms. More than just the syndicate. You pissed off the wrong people, girl. You got 3 different contracts out on you. 2 are capture only. One's dead or alive. Jace clenched his jaw. Who put up the dead or alive? Vaughn hesitated. Then he tapped another command and a new name appeared. Jace's stomach dropped. House Volteros. He turned to Veyna. That's your family, isn't it? Veyna's expression was unreadable. Yes. Vaughn let out a low whistle. Damn, you really pissed off the wrong people. Jace stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. Why does your own family want you dead? Veyna didn't answer immediately. Her fingers curled into fists. They don't, she said finally. My mother does. Jace exchanged a look with Vaughn. This was worse than he thought. House Volteros wasn't just some wealthy family. It was one of the ruling houses of the syndicate. They controlled entire sectors. If Veyna was tied to them, she wasn't just important. She was royalty. Vaughn shook his head. You need to disappear fast. This bounty's too high, someone's gonna turn you in eventually. Jace rubbed a hand down his face. Got any ideas? Vaughn hesitated. Then he sighed. Yeah, but you're not gonna like it. Jace exhaled. At this point I'll take whatever I can get. Vaughn tapped the holo screen again. A star map appeared, highlighting a route leading out of the system. There's an old smuggler ship docked at Port 9, unregistered. If you get to it before the syndicate locks down the docks, you can get off-world. Jace frowned. And the catch? Vaughn gave him a flat look. The guy who owns it isn't exactly friendly. Jace exhaled. Great. He turned to Veyna. You up for stealing a ship? She straightened, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. If it gets me out of here, she said, then let's steal a damn ship. Vaughn groaned. I'm going to regret this. Jace grinned. You always do. Vaughn shut down the holo and moved toward a locked cabinet. He keyed in a code and the door slid open, revealing a small but deadly collection of weapons. He tossed Jace a compact blaster. You're gonna need it. Jace checked the charge, then turned to Veyna. Let's move. The docks weren't far, but time was running out. The syndicate wouldn't wait forever, and neither would their hunters. Jace and Veyna moved fast, weaving through the city's back alleys. The air smelled of damp metal and ozone, the neon glow of the skyline casting long shadows across the rain-slick streets. The closer they got to Port 9, the heavier the security presence became. Syndicate patrols were tightening their grip, their sleek black armored figures sweeping through checkpoints, scanning faces, and interrogating anyone who looked suspicious. Jace pulled Veyna into a narrow passage between 2 crumbling storage units, pressing his back against the cold wall. She was breathing hard, her violet skin flushed with exertion. He glanced toward the docks, only 2 blocks away, but there were syndicate enforcers stationed at every entrance. We're not getting through that way, he muttered. Veyna followed his gaze. Then we need another way. Jace thought fast. Port 9 was built into a massive industrial complex, layers upon layers of forgotten infrastructure buried beneath the newer docking stations. If the main gates were locked down, there had to be a way through the lower levels, maintenance tunnels, old smuggler routes, something. Then he spotted it, a side entrance half hidden beneath a massive stack of cargo containers. The access panel was rusted and dented, a relic of an older security system. It wasn't in use anymore, probably overlooked in the syndicate's crackdown. Jace pointed. There, Veyna nodded, already moving. Jace followed, staying low, checking over his shoulder every few seconds. They reached the panel and Jace wiped the grime off the control screen. Let's hope this still works. Veyna crouched beside him, glancing around. If it doesn't, then we improvise. Jace pulled a small tool from his belt, a multi-spike designed for slicing into outdated systems. He jammed it into the panel's interface, watching as the cracked screen flickered weakly to life. The device hummed, cycling through old access codes. A tense few seconds passed. Then with a clunk, the door slid open. Jace grinned. Bingo! They slipped inside just as distant voices echoed down the alley. Jace pulled the door shut behind them, plunging them into near darkness. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of old fuel. Where does this lead? Veyna whispered. Jace flicked on a dim wrist light, illuminating the narrow corridor. If I'm right, it should drop us near Dock C, closer to our ride. Veyna nodded, following him deeper into the tunnel. Their footsteps were muffled on the metal grates, but every noise felt too loud. Jace's nerves were on edge. The Syndicate wasn't stupid. If they had this area locked down, it was only a matter of time before they noticed an old door suddenly opened. The tunnel sloped downward, then split into a junction. Jace checked his wrist display, pulling up a rough map Vaughn had loaded onto his system. Left, he said. They moved quickly, winding through the maze of old service pathways. As they rounded a bend, the tunnel widened into an open chamber, an old cargo processing hub, and they weren't alone. A group of Syndicate operatives stood near the far exit, their black armor reflecting the dim emergency lights. Jace cursed under his breath, pulling Veyna back behind a rusted storage crate. They're blocking the way, she whispered. Jace scanned the room, mind racing. They were outnumbered and a direct fight wasn't an option. Then he spotted a maintenance ladder leading up to an overhead catwalk. If they could get above, they might be able to bypass the guards entirely. He pointed. Up there. Veyna nodded. They moved carefully, keeping low, weaving between old machinery. Jace climbed the ladder first, testing the rungs. Some were rusted, but they held. Veyna followed, silent and quick. From above, they had a better vantage point. The guards were focused on a console, scanning through data feeds. They weren't expecting anyone above them. Jace led Veyna along the catwalk, stepping lightly to avoid making noise. The exit was just ahead. If they could just, one of the rungs snapped. The sound was loud enough to make one of the guards glance up. Jace froze, heart pounding. The guard squinted, eyes scanning the shadows. For a terrifying second, Jace thought they were caught. Then a distant alarm blared somewhere in the port. The guards stiffened, their comms lighting up. Sector 4 breach. Move. Just like that, they rushed out, their footsteps vanishing down the corridor. Jace exhaled sharply. That was lucky. Veyna gave him a look. I don't believe in luck. Jace grinned. Then let's call it good timing. They climbed down and slipped through the now unsecured exit, emerging into the docks. The massive landing bays stretched before them, ships lined up like towering beasts. Workers and droids bustled about, cargo being loaded and unloaded. But Jace only cared about one ship there. At the far end of Dock C sat a worn but functional smuggler's vessel. It wasn't flashy, but it had a reinforced hull and a warp drive that could get them far away from the Syndicate's reach. Veyna's eyes locked onto it. That's our way out, Jace nodded. Yeah. Then he saw the problem. A crew was already boarding, and at the bottom of the ramp stood a tall, scarred man, broad shoulders, cybernetic arm, a plasma rifle slung across his chest. His expression was stone cold. Jace groaned. Veyna arched an eyebrow. Let me guess, you know him. Jace sighed. Oh yeah. The man turned, his gaze sweeping the docks. Then his eyes locked onto Jace, his face twisted into a smirk. Well, he called out, if it ain't Jace Terran. You got some real nerve showing up here. Jace forced a grin. Hey, Rollo, long time no see. Veyna glanced between them. Should I be worried? Rollo's smirk widened. That depends, sweetheart. Is your boyfriend here gonna pay me for that ship? His smirk faded, eyes narrowing. Or do I have to take it back? Jace muttered under his breath. This was about to get complicated. Rollo's stance shifted slightly, the bulky cybernetic arm twitching, ready to reach for his weapon. The smile had left his face entirely now, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. Jace stepped forward, not breaking eye contact, even though his heart was hammering in his chest. "Look, Rollo," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I didn't come here to make trouble. I just need that ship and I'll make sure you're paid for it. You know I've got the credits." Rollo's lip curled into a snarl. "The credits aren't the problem, Jace. You've got a lot of people after you right now, and you've got a lot of nerve coming to me for help. What makes you think I won't just take that ship and leave you out in the dust?" Veyna stayed silent behind Jace, but Jace could feel her presence, her energy crackling in the air between them. She was tense, watching Rollo with a sharp, calculating gaze of her own, though she didn't seem as on edge as Jace felt. Maybe she had her own way of handling these situations. He wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. "Rollo," Jace said again, trying to remain calm, "this isn't just about me. I've got someone with me. She's valuable. The Syndicate's been hunting her and they'll tear apart anyone who gets in their way." He threw a glance over his shoulder at Veyna. Veyna met his eyes for a split second, her expression unreadable. She'd been quiet through this whole exchange, and Jace didn't know if she was sizing Rollo up, wondering if they could use his help or if she was just waiting. Jace turned back to Rollo. "I'm asking you to help us. You've done worse for less." Rollo's lips twitched as though he might laugh. He looked between the two of them, Jace and Veyna. He seemed to weigh the situation carefully. For a moment, Jace thought he might just wave them off. But then Rollo took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Taryn," Rollo said, his voice low and dangerous. "The Syndicate wants her. They'll come for her, they'll come for you, and they'll burn the whole damn port down if they have to. And me, I've got a reputation to keep. If I help you, I'm signing my own death warrant." Jace swallowed. He knew the stakes, knew how dangerous it was to involve people like Rollo. But he wasn't going to let them get caught now, not when they were so close. He had to convince him. "Rollo," Jace said again, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a level just above a whisper. "You owe me. Remember the job on Garax 4, the one you screwed up?" Rollo's jaw clenched, the memory hitting him like a punch. "You didn't have to bring that up, Taryn," he growled. "I've been paying for that mistake ever since." Jace leaned in just a little, matching his tone. "Then here's your chance to clear that debt. Help me get her off-world and I'll make sure you never have to deal with those credits again." There was silence for a long moment. Rollo's eyes were unreadable, scanning Jace, flicking to Veyna, then back again. His thoughts were behind a thick wall, but Jace could see the faintest flicker of doubt. And then Rollo exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You're a pain in my ass, Taryn, but fine, I'll help you." Jace let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "You won't regret it." Rollo's smirk returned, but it wasn't as friendly this time. "Yeah, well, if I die for this, I'm coming for you in the afterlife." Jace chuckled, though the laughter didn't reach his eyes. "Deal." Rollo turned to Veyna, sizing her up for a moment before giving her a nod. "You better be worth all this trouble, girl." Veyna held his gaze, her posture regal despite the grime and weariness from the chase. "I'm more than worth it." Rollo didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside and waved them toward the ramp leading to the ship. "Get on. I've got a ship to catch too." They hurried up the ramp, and Jace could hear the sound of distant footsteps echoing in the distance. The Syndicate hadn't found them yet, but they wouldn't stay unaware for long. Inside the ship was dim, lit only by the soft hum of the engines. The interior was utilitarian, nothing fancy, just the bare essentials to get from one place to another. Veyna moved quickly toward the cockpit, but Jace grabbed her arm gently before she could go too far. "We still need to make it off the dock undetected," he said quietly. Veyna looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You trust him?" Jace hesitated, then nodded. "He's all we've got right now. Just follow my lead." She nodded, though her expression remained neutral. There was a quiet intensity to her, as if she was constantly analyzing everything, calculating every move. Jace moved toward the rear of the ship, securing a seat while Rollo started flicking switches in the cockpit. He muttered under his breath, his hands a blur as he initiated pre-flight sequences. The sound of the engine started to hum louder, vibrations shuddering through the hull. "Hold on," Rollo called back, grinning, his voice tinged with dark humor. "We're getting out of here one way or another." Jace glanced at Veyna one more time. Her face was set, determined. For a moment he caught a flicker of something trust, and then, without another word, the ship's engines roared to life, lifting off the ground. They were leaving the docks, leaving the Syndicate behind, at least for now. But Jace knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and no matter how far they flew, the Syndicate wouldn't stop until they had Veyna, and they'd come after him too. The ship surged through the atmosphere, leaving the cluttered, noisy dock behind. The world outside the viewport turned from the dull gray of the city to the deep black of space, broken only by the distant flicker of stars. Jace leaned back in his seat, letting the tension in his body finally loosen. He hadn't realized how tightly wounded he'd been until the threat of confrontation had passed. Yet, even as he relaxed, the unease gnawed at him. The Syndicate was relentless, and they would find them sooner or later. In the cockpit, Rollo muttered curses as he guided the ship toward a more secure course through the stars. His hands flew over the controls, checking readouts and systems, making sure they were safe, for now. Veyna was quiet. She stood by the viewport, her silhouette framed by the stars, staring out into the vastness. She hadn't spoken much since they'd boarded, her demeanor as distant as the space around them. Jace could feel the weight of the silence between them. It was almost suffocating. He couldn't read her, not entirely. Her eyes held secrets in the way she carried herself. It was like she was holding back a storm, one that might break at any moment. "You okay?" Jace asked, breaking the quiet. Veyna didn't look at him at first, but he saw the slight tension in her shoulders before she turned toward him. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You sure?" he pressed, leaning forward in his seat. "Because you haven't said a word since we left." Veyna's gaze flicked to Rollo in the cockpit before returning to him. Her lips parted as though she might say something, but then she closed them again. It was like she was still deciding whether to let him in. Finally, she exhaled slowly. "I don't know how to feel about all this." Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "I'm used to being on the run, but not like this. I've never had anyone offer help without expecting something in return." Jace raised an eyebrow. "You don't think Rollo's expecting something?" She shook her head slightly, a wry smile playing at the corners of her lips. "No, he's already got everything he wants. He's not like the others." Her eyes flicked to the control panel where the flashing lights cast an eerie glow. The ship hummed steadily beneath them, the quiet rhythm of it almost soothing if you didn't think too hard about the enemies hunting them down. "I thought I could do this alone," she continued, her voice quieter now. "But every time I think I'm free, I'm reminded that I'm not." Jace felt a pang in his chest, something tight and uncomfortable. He could hear the fear in her voice even if she wasn't admitting it outright. "You're not alone now." Veyna turned her gaze to him, and for a moment the world outside the ship seemed to fade away. There was a vulnerability in her eyes, a crack in the armor she wore so effortlessly. "And I don't know what to do with that." Jace felt his pulse quicken. Something about the weight of her words, the way she looked at him, it sent a jolt of something through him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Then let me help you figure it out," he said, his voice low but firm. For a long time, Veyna didn't answer. Instead, she simply looked at him, her gaze searching, as though she was trying to understand something in him. Jace's breath caught, but he didn't look away. He wasn't sure what it was, but something was shifting between them, something real. The moment was interrupted by a sudden, sharp tone from the cockpit. Rollo's voice came over the intercom. "Hold on, you two. We've got incoming." Jace's stomach dropped. He quickly stood, his hand reaching for his sidearm instinctively. Veyna was already moving, her body shifting like water, agile and precise. "On my mark, you'll take the aft," she said, her eyes locking with his. "Cover me and I'll handle the ship's defenses." He nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever was coming, they were going to face it together. He could see the change in her then, the way her focus sharpened, the subtle shift in her posture. She wasn't the same person he'd met a few days ago. There was a strength in her now, a quiet confidence that he hadn't seen before. "Mark," she said. Without thinking, Jace moved to the rear hatch, his weapon drawn and ready. His mind raced as he scanned the dark space outside the ship. There was a cold edge to everything now, and his nerves hummed with the anticipation of what might come next. Moments later, the ship lurched and the intercom crackled again. "We're being locked onto multiple ships. I need you to hold steady." Jace's grip tightened on the handle of his weapon, his heart hammering in his chest. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding. Then the ship was rocked again, a loud thud vibrating through the hull. Rollo cursed over the intercom and Jace heard the sound of heavy blaster fire in the distance. Veyna moved with a calm efficiency, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Brace for impact. We're getting out of here no matter what." Jace's eyes darted to the viewport. There was nothing but the void of space, nothing to indicate what they were up against, but he knew, they knew, that whoever was out there had no intention of letting them leave without a fight. He turned back to Veyna, their gazes locking once again. There was something in her eyes now, something fierce, something unyielding. She was ready. Jace didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. They had each other's backs. That was enough. For now. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jace could feel the hair on the back of his neck rise as he stood in the rear hatch, his weapon aimed at the darkness outside. Rollo's voice echoed through the comms, but it was barely audible over the sounds of the ship's engines and the distant blaster fire. "We're too close to the enemy," Rollo growled, his voice tight with panic. "I can't get enough speed to evade. We're going to have to fight our way out." Jace's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. His eyes scanned the empty space, searching for any signs of movement, anything that might give away their attackers. For a moment, there was nothing, just the distant stars and the endless void. Then a flash of light, a sudden explosion ripped through the quiet. The ship jolted hard, throwing Jace off balance. He staggered but quickly regained his footing, his heart pounding in his chest. "Damn it," Rollo shouted, his voice filled with fury. "We've been hit." "Shields are down to 40%. Jace didn't hesitate. He was already moving toward the cockpit, gun raised. Veyna had already gone to the controls, her fingers flying over the panels, her expression set in concentration. "We need to get to the weapons array," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We can't rely on shields anymore." Jace nodded and they moved as one, their footsteps synchronized in the narrow hall of the ship. He didn't need to look back to know Veyna was right behind him, every move fluid and precise. He had never seen anyone handle danger like she did. They reached the weapons bay in record time. The small compartment was filled with blasters and other heavy artillery, but Jace's eyes were fixed on the control panel in the corner. "I'll get the targeting system online," Jace said, approaching the console. He began inputting commands, his fingers flying over the keys as he worked. The familiar hum of the weapon systems warming up filled the space. Veyna was already loading a blaster, her face set in a mask of determination. She moved with a focused intensity, her eyes flicking back and forth between the viewport and the weapons bay. "I'll cover you," she said, her voice steady. Jace didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip on the blaster, his focus narrowing as he lined up the ship's targeting system. The moment they were ready, they'd need to fight back, hard. Another explosion rocked the ship, this one closer than the last. The lights flickered for a moment before steadying, and the comms crackled with Rollo's voice. "We're too exposed. I'm not going to survive this if we don't get some distance." Jace clenched his jaw. They needed to get out of range fast. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then hit the button that activated the ship's weapons. The guns hummed to life, and the targeting system aligned with a pinpoint accuracy. "Ready," Jace called to Veyna. "Let's make this count." Without waiting for a reply, Veyna moved forward, blasting the closest enemy ship with deadly precision. The ship rocked again, but this time it was the enemy's craft that exploded, the debris scattering in every direction. One down, Jace thought, but there were still more. Several more ships moved into view, their sleek, black forms cutting through space like predators on the hunt. The odds were quickly stacking up against them. Jace's fingers flew over the controls, locking onto another enemy ship. He fired a shot, and the energy blast shot through the darkness, hitting the target with a direct hit. The ship's shields flickered for a moment before failing entirely, and it exploded in a brilliant flash. But even as they took out two of the attackers, more arrived. The viewport filled with the bright streaks of incoming fire, each one getting closer and closer. "Rollo, we need to get out of here," Jace shouted, his hands gripping the weapon's console. "Can you make a jump to warp?" There was a pause, then Rollo's voice came over the comms, more strained than before. "I can't. I need at least 2 minutes to line up the coordinates. We're too far from the nearest station, and if I jump now, we'll risk falling into uncharted space." Jace cursed under his breath, frustration gnawing at him. They were running out of time. "Veyna," he said, his voice steady despite the mounting tension, "we need to clear a path now." She looked at him, her eyes glowing with determination. "On it." And just like that, she moved to the controls, her fingers dancing over the blaster settings as she prepared for another round of fire. Jace's gaze flicked back to the enemy ships, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. The odds were stacked against them, and every second that passed felt like it might be their last. But there was something else. Something in the way Veyna moved, the way her eyes locked with his as she fired once again. He could feel it. Something had changed between them. The connection that had started as a fragile thread was now a bond, unspoken but undeniable. With a sudden burst of energy, they pushed forward, the ship shuddering as they broke through the enemy's line. The remaining ships were slow to respond, and they took advantage of the brief window, sending shots into every ship in sight. The enemy fire grew weaker, less precise. One by one they took them down, clearing the skies of their attackers. The final ship exploded in a burst of light, and for a moment everything was quiet again. Jace exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "We're clear," Veyna said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Rollo's voice came through the comms. "That was too close." "You two are lucky I didn't just leave you behind." Jace couldn't help but grin. "Lucky's my middle name." Veyna turned toward him, her expression softening for the first time since they'd boarded the ship. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something more than just gratitude. Jace met her gaze, and for a long moment they stood there, the weight of the battle fading into the background. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jace smiled, his heart still racing. Anytime. They had survived this fight, but the war was far from over. Want more thrilling adventures like this? Don't miss out. Subscribe now and join us for brand new stories every day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next twist in the tale. We've got so much more to share.